Hi there, welcome to another episode of Teaching with Text. My name's Richard, and today I'll be talking about Julia Lovell's book, Maoism, A Global History, that came out back in 2019. And I'll be talking you through how I've used it in my teaching, and today I'll be giving you some ideas about how you can incorporate it, or elements of this book, into your own teaching, and why and how you can do that, why you should do it, and how you can go about doing that. First of all, I used it in a sense of, I teach in the International Baccalaureate, the diploma programme. I've also taught in the UK A level as well, GCSE. And within that, as part of our paper 2, independence movements and also authoritarian states, the figure of Mao kind of looms large. And there's a particular part of the book here, page 276, that I'm going to talk about today and give you some ideas from my own teaching about how you can use it in yours. First off, it's largely because it's very useful in terms of challenging some of the students' preconceived ideas about Mao. Because usually when they come into the classroom, they've heard of Mao, the dictator, and no doubt the very sort of negative side, in a way, of that recent post-war Chinese history. Understandably so, that's kind of the sort of I suppose, the more common narrative, if you like. And what's interesting about this book is, and what will challenge those preconceived ideas, is the fact of Mao becoming, in a way, a kind of figurehead for anti-colonial movements as we move into the 1960s and beyond, which is a really good way of challenging these ideas that students might have, and also adding complexity in terms of questioning why would people, knowing what we know about, things like the Great Famine and latterly the Cultural Revolution, why would anyone be looking towards Mao as this kind of figurehead for revolutionary movements in the post-war world? So for me in my teaching, I said before, using Asian independence movements, particularly sort of looking at Vietnam, for example, often people, at this time are looking to China as an alternative to the Soviet Union. And the section in sort of 276 does this really, really well, looking at the issue around the Vietnam War by the sort of 1960s, and how that is, especially in Asia, starting to sour the way that many people look at American foreign policy at the time, and are now looking towards Maoist China as an alternative to that kind of power base that we see in the post-war world. And I kind of use it to look at why and how they, why are people kind of attracted to Maoism. And again, Julia Lovell in the book here, in that section around page 276, focuses in on the Vietnam War and looks at Mao's support for Ho Chi Minh in terms of that conflict, and again how through that support, therefore that kind of, if you like, burnishes and bolsters Mao's image, which often runs counter, as I said before, in my experience in my classes, with how students perceive Mao, and they can find that quite kind of jolting, which I think is really good for them to start to develop a more nuanced and a more complex picture of the region at the time, and also adds, I think, to many students' ideas in a sense of they sometimes struggle to sort of see the interconnected nature of the post-war world in terms of anti-colonial movements, the kind of the sort of ending phase, if you like, of European imperialism as well. And it really helps to connect that together. And you've also got this real sort of shift at the time, which I'm going to quote from the book as well. That's something I used in my teaching that I think is really good that Lovell brings out. It's talking about the Soviet Union no longer represented an emancipatory alternative to the forces of capitalist oppression. So again, in my own teaching, I've used that to look at this fissure that develops between the Soviet Union on the one hand and Maoist China on the other, and how, and again, because I look at Mao from as an authoritarian leader, as a dictator as well, so looking at how he sees China at that time, and I use in my classes, use elements of the book, as I've just said here, to then get students to see, well, why does he how is he looking to position China in the wider world? And we really see that sort of changing really by the time we get to the late 1960s. And again, I've used the book and that part of the book to use the context of the Vietnam War as well, like when I've been teaching the Vietnam War, to see that as a kind of catalyst for this changing image of Maoist China, and that he's becoming this kind of galvanizing figure in many respects, especially around the globe, but especially one could say in this region in Asia. So really useful. And she also, again, in that part I like, because she quotes other historians like Max Albaum as well, talking about how, quote here, China is a new center for world revolutionary movement, which in itself I used in my own teaching to get students to kind of analyze that shift, how and why it's coming about. I said before, we look at the Vietnam War, we look at the impact previously and sort of concomitant to that in terms of the Korean War as well. So really start to see how and why that's shifting, and vis-a-vis, I suppose, in a way, the perceived failure of the Soviet Union to act as a sort of a counterweight, a counterbalance, and a counter-narrative to kind of perceptions of Western imperialism in a sort of post-war world. So it really is a very interesting book, and I felt, for me in my own teaching, that it helped to draw out the complexities of this for students, and they gained much more of a broader context of how these ideas are seeping out into the world, and how the attention is shifting, and also how communism, I suppose, again has kind of been revitalized by Mao. This comes out in the book as well that I used in my own teaching. It's been revitalized by Mao and seen as an anti-colonial movement, and seen as a sort of focal point for anti-imperialism again. So that's, again, another really interesting point that you can draw out in your own teaching and use in your own lessons as well. So all in all, a fantastic book, really interesting and quite jarring as well. I think would be very useful, as I said before, at really challenging students' conceptions of imperialism, communism, especially within an Asian context as well. And that's something I found in my own teaching to be very useful, and enabled me to really drill down into students' ideas about communism, and also within that the split within communism between the kind of Chinese and Soviet spheres as well. So all in all, a very useful book to look at the post-war world in the 50s and 60s. Thank you. Thanks for listening.